Hi, I'm Liam from Batch Brewing Co. On today's Beerducation, we're going to talk about stouts and porters. As with a lot of beer history, the origin of the porter is a little murky. The most popular, though often debated origin story of the porter style brings us to London in 1722. Ralph Harwood was the owner of the Bell Brew House in Shoreditch, London. The story goes that Ralph created the style for one of his customers, the publican of the Blue Last. At the time, it was common practice for publicans to blend beer from multiple casks. This was done behind the bar, blended to suit the customer's taste. While this let the publican fine-tune the taste of his beers, it was also a handy way for the publican to get rid of some dodgy casks. These could be beers that are infected or just not that good. The publican at the Blue Last asked Ralph to pre-blend these beers at the brewery so he could serve it just from the one cask behind the bar. This blended cask became very popular with the punters at the Blue Last, many of whom worked as porters. The porter's job was to carry supplies from local merchants to different customers, many of whom were in markets around the area. Or they were like dock workers, loading and unloading the ships on the River Thames. So porters were the working class equivalent to a modern day delivery driver, and it's these delivery drivers that the beer got its name from. So while it's a good story, it's debatable if that's actually where the origin of the porter came from. What we do know is the porters that we drink today are very different from these original porters brewed back then. Due to the rudimentary process for malting, these early porters would actually be quite smoky, and most probably also sour. This is because these beers spend quite a long time maturing in wooden vats. These wooden vats would likely get infected from wild yeast such as Brettanomyces or Lactobacillus. The brewers of the time didn't have the same knowledge of cleaning and sanitation as modern brewers do today. For the next 100 years or so, the popularity of the style just grew and grew. This led porters to be the most drunk beer style in London and eventually exported all over the world. In order to keep up with the demand of their thirsty customers, these London breweries had to ramp up their production and size. In fact, these growing London breweries were the first ever mega or mass-produced breweries in the world. This surge in size and output to meet demand led to the famous London beer flood. Like many of the local breweries, the Mew Brewery's biggest porter vats were 6.7 metres high and could hold over 3 million litres of beer. Unfortunately, in October of 1814, one of these huge brewing vats burst. The resulting flood tore through and destroyed the brewery and swept away nearby houses. Tragically, 8 people passed away as a result of the flood. Moving on to stouts, porters and stouts are very closely linked. Even today, there's a lot of discussion on how to separate these two styles. In the 1800s, the porter's popularity began to wane. Breweries started releasing variations of the style. One popular version was a stout porter. These were stronger in flavour and higher in alcohol. And over time, that name just shortened to stout. Without a doubt, the most popular stout, or even dark beer in general, is Guinness. Sir Arthur Guinness began brewing in Dublin in 1759. Inspired by the prevalence of the porter style in Ireland, he began brewing it himself, and by 1799 he was only brewing porters. In the 1820s, Arthur's son, also named Arthur, took over the brewery and began brewing an extra stout porter. This beer became very popular, and over time just became known as Guinness Stout. Now let's explore some of these styles. The first style we're going to talk about is the English porter. The English porter is the original and a great beer to get into the style. With porters, the malt should be dark and toasty, but shouldn't have any burnt or overly roasted character. While classic versions like this Fuller's London Porter are easily available in Australia, we also have some great locally brewed examples of the style. This porter is from the Wicked Elf Brewery, and they're located in Port Macquarie. Next, we're going to talk about the milk or sweet stout style. The name comes from the addition of lactose to the beer. Lactose is a sugar that's naturally found in milk and is actually what's called an unfermentable sugar. This means that the yeast can't eat the sugars found in lactose, and that sweetness remains in the finished beer. Batch's milk stout, which is else to the milk stout, is also carbonated with nitrogen, so there's a slightly different way to pour these styles of beers. The combination of the lactose and the nitrogen gives us a beer that's slightly sweet and very creamy. And while this milk stout contains nitrogen, there are plenty of modern versions that are just carbonated normally. The Oatmeal Stout like we have here is another variant of the stout style. And as the name says, these beers contain oatmeal in the malt grist or the malt recipe. Interestingly, these beers were originally marketed as a healthy alternative because of the addition of the oats. Early versions of the style didn't actually contain a lot of oats. They were mainly just a handful added in just so they could claim that healthy tagline. Modern versions like this Grifter Oatmeal Stout contain a much higher quantity of oats. The Oatmeal Stout was a very popular style during the 40s and 50s, and has then seen a big boom during the craft beer revolution. Next up is the Irish Stout. The style evolved from the London Porter, but is fuller and creamier and more stout in body and mouthfeel. Many times when you talk to someone about dark beer, the beer they're thinking of is Guinness, because it is the most popular dark beer in the world. The brewing techniques and recipes for Guinness have changed over the years, and Guinness was one of the first producers to use black patent malts and later on roasted and flaked barley. As you can see, when opening a nitro can, they can be a little bit lively. The nitrogenated can is one of the things that people think most about with the Guinness. You can see that with its lovely pour. And the next style we're going to look at is the Imperial Stout. These were originally brewed in London for export to the Baltic region. The name comes from the Russian Imperial Court, who were big fans and big consumers of imported London Imperial Stout. As tension grew between England and the Baltic regions, the Baltic countries started to produce these beers locally. Though traditionally English in style, the Imperial Stout has become very popular in the US and across the world. These non-English versions are typically quite hoppier and bitter in their flavour. The Imperial Stout is a bigger, boozier, richer, more complex version of the stout. And what we have here is the 8-wide Ice Stout from New Zealand. And the last style we're going to look at today is the Pastry Stout. The Pastry Stout is not an official style in the style guidelines, but they're a modern take on the milk or sweet stout style. These beers are generally quite sweet and have a laundry list of other ingredients, or as we call adjuncts, to replicate different pastries and desserts. And we've got two pastry stouts in front of us. From Batch we have the Little Lou's Creme Brulee, and here we have the Noah from Onipolo, which is a pancake Imperial Stout with pecans. So these beers are a bit contentious in the old world beer world because of the high level of other ingredients and the fact they're really just to replicate desserts and dishes. Due to the popularity of the pastry stouts, we're now seeing other variations like pastry sours and even pastry seltzers. That's going to conclude it for today for Beerducation. Catch you next time. I'm going to sit back and enjoy this pecan pancake Imperial Stout.